the sun-drenched laughter of a perfect pool day, the crisp sound of ice clinking in a glass. A single triumphant spark streaks across the flawless blue sky. The world slows. The spark ignites a cascade of vibrant, screaming fire that isn't supposed to be there. And as the beautiful, chaotic shrapnel rains down, Karen's perfect day becomes a battleground of her own making, a twisted reflection of a past she thought she'd buried forever. The afternoon sun beat down on Karen's backyard, a kingdom of manicured perfection she had spent a year building. The pool, a shimmering rectangle of chlorinated sapphire, was the centerpiece. The lounge chairs were aligned with military precision, the white cushions unblemished. On a mahogany table, a spread of artisanal cheese and cucumber sandwiches sat under a mesh dome, untouched by the common fly. This was not a casual gathering. This was a statement, an event designed to silently scream, "This is what success looks like." Karen herself was the living embodiment of that statement. Dressed in a one-piece swimsuit with a geometric print, she wore a wide-brimmed sun hat that cast a shadow over her perfectly applied makeup. Her expression, however, was a faint line of tension. She surveyed the scene with a hawk's eye, her gaze flicking from her 10-year-old son, Liam, who was quietly stacking pool noodles, to her husband, David, who was attempting to make polite conversation with their new neighbors, the Andersons. The Andersons, a young couple who had moved in 3 months ago, were everything Karen wasn't: laid back, effortlessly happy, and a little too loud for her taste. Their son Leo was splashing enthusiastically in the shallow end, a rogue wave of pure, joyful chaos. "Liam, darling," Karen's voice cut through the air, sharp as a needle. "Please don't stack the noodles like that. They'll get bent. They're meant to be arranged neatly in the storage bin." Liam's shoulders slumped. "Sorry, Mom." David shot Karen a subtle warning look, but she ignored it, turning her attention back to the Andersons. "Well, it's just wonderful that you could join us. We do try to keep things civil on the block. A certain standard, you know." Mr. Anderson, a lanky man with a perpetually amused smirk, sipped his iced tea. "Oh, we know. We're still getting the hang of it." His wife, Maya, laughed, a rich, genuine sound that seemed to grate on Karen's nerves. The tension, taut and almost invisible, was a familiar companion. It had been with Karen since she started the landscaping project, since she decided this pool would be the ultimate symbol of her new life. The life she'd fought so hard to create after? Well, after. She didn't think about that. Not anymore. This was her reality now. This was control. Then came the sound. It wasn't loud at first, just a low, persistent hiss from somewhere beyond the Andersons' backyard fence. A crackle like dry leaves scuffling in the wind. Karen paused, her glass halfway to her lips. She scowled, her perfect brow furrowed. It sounded electrical, unsafe. David looked up, a frown on his face. "What's that?" Before anyone could answer, the hiss became a roar. A vibrant, red-hot starburst erupted from the Andersons' yard, soaring 50 feet into the air. It hung there for a split second, a malevolent sun, before it exploded in a magnificent, deafening burst of golden sparks and glittering streamers. The perfect day shattered. A collective gasp went up as the first shower of fiery projectiles rained down. They weren't just pretty light. They were tiny, burning meteors. One hit a lounge chair, sizzling a black hole in the pristine white cushion. Another struck the table, igniting the delicate lace doily that Karen had so carefully placed. The cheese dome, a symbol of her careful planning, was knocked askew as a bright green flare landed beside it. Liam, who had been standing beside the pool, let out a terrified shriek. The golden rain was coming down thicker now. David grabbed Liam, shielding him with his body. The Andersons were scrambling, yelling, their faces a mixture of fear and shock. Karen, for a moment, was frozen. Her world, her carefully constructed, flawless world, was on fire. The meticulously arranged scene was in ruins. The firework-laden air smelled of sulfur and burnt plastic, a foul odor that clung to everything, an insult to her perfectly fresh cucumber sandwiches. This wasn't chaos. This was an affront. A personal attack. Her fury, a cold, hard stone in her chest, began to heat up. She didn't run for cover. She didn't scream in terror. Instead, she stood her ground, her fists clenched, her jaw tight. Her gaze, a lethal combination of rage and disbelief, scanned the chaos until it settled on a figure in the Andersons' yard. It was Mark, Mr. Anderson's older brother, who she had seen in passing once or twice. He was standing beside a smoking, overturned bucket, a bewildered expression on his face, a cheap plastic lighter still clutched in his hand. The last of the fireworks sizzled out. A thick haze of smoke hung in the humid air. The fire alarm on their house began to shriek, a monotonous, piercing wail that sealed the day's ruin. Karen strode across the lawn, a woman on a mission. She didn't wait for David to catch up. She didn't call the fire department. Her focus was singular. Her blood was a river of ice and boiling anger. She reached the property line, her feet planted on her side of the fence. Mark looked at her, his expression sheepish. "I am so sorry, Karen," he said, his voice a low mumble. The box was supposed to be a dud. "The guy on the corner, he said they were just for show, you know? Just a cheap bit of fun. I swear I had no idea they were live." "Live?" Karen's voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of 1,000 judgments. She pointed a trembling finger at the smoldering cushion, the melted cheese dome, the singed lawn. "Does this look like fun to you, Mark?" Her perfect world was a mess, and the stakes were about to escalate beyond a few ruined cushions. As she spoke, Liam let out a loud, painful sob. David's voice, a panicked whisper, followed. "Karen, we need to get him inside. He got something in his eye!" Karen turned. David was holding Liam, who was clutching his eye, his face twisted in pain. A thin red line snaked down his cheek, and his eye was already swelling, the sclera turning a vivid, alarming red. A piece of the firework had lodged itself under his eyelid. This wasn't just about a damaged lawn anymore. This was personal. This was about her son. Her perfect, quiet son. Karen's face, already a mask of fury, contorted into something venomous. She looked at Mark, his face pale with horror. The flimsy excuse of a dud box of fireworks felt like a direct punch to the gut. She took a step back, her rage a living thing now. "You!" she spat, her voice laced with pure venom. "You have no idea." And as she turned to rush to her son, the front door of her house, a beacon of her supposedly stable life, swung open. A police officer stood on the porch, a phone pressed to his ear. He looked from the smoldering wreckage of her pool party to the frantic, pain-filled scene with her son. He lowered the phone, his eyes settling on Karen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "My name is Officer Ramirez. We got an anonymous tip about illegal fireworks. Do you know where they came from?" Karen opened her mouth to speak, to point an accusing finger at Mark, but Officer Ramirez's gaze shifted to the ground. He knelt and picked up a small empty cardboard box, its label charred but readable. He held it up to the light, and Karen's world, already in freefall, stopped dead. It was the specific brand logo for Starfire Pyrotechnics, a company she had worked for briefly 10 years ago. Not just that, it was the specific model number, a type she had herself signed off on as safe. A box of fireworks that had been illegally discontinued years ago after a series of tragic accidents. A box she had personally overseen the destruction of. And here it was, in the hands of the man who had just shattered her perfect life. The officer's hand, steady and professional, held the box like it was evidence in a high-profile case. The Starfire Pyrotechnics logo, a stylized comet trailing a vibrant red line, burned itself into Karen's memory. Her mind, already a maelstrom of fear and fury, snapped into an icy, analytical clarity. This wasn't a random accident. This was impossible. This was a ghost from her past, a meticulously buried secret rising from the ashes of her perfect pool party. "Ma'am," Officer Ramirez repeated, his voice cutting through the ringing of the fire alarm. "I'll ask again. Do you know where these came from?" Karen's gaze darted from the box to Mark, the pathetic, bewildered man standing in the Andersons' yard. He looked terrified. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a combination of remorse and fear. He had no idea what he had just unleashed. David was still holding Liam, his voice a low, panicked murmur as he tried to calm their son. The contrast was a slap in the face. Her husband and child, vulnerable and in pain, while she stood transfixed by a piece of cardboard. That's his," Karen said, her voice strained. She pointed a trembling finger at Mark. He said he bought them from some guy on a corner. He said they were duds. Mark shook his head wildly. No, I didn't know. They were just supposed to be for a laugh. Officer Ramirez ignored him. His eyes, dark and piercing, remained fixed on Karen. And you know this brand? The question hung in the humid, sulfur-scented air. It was a simple yes or no, but the answer felt like a confession. It felt like admitting to a crime she thought had been expunged from her record. She could lie. She could say no. But he was holding the box. He could trace it. The truth would come out, messy and ugly, and it would be worse. Yes, she said, the word a bitter pill in her mouth. I used to work for them, years ago, in R&D. Officer Ramirez nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. He took out a notepad. And you said you saw him with this box, ma'am? Mr. Mark, Karen supplied, her mind racing. The fire alarm continued its insistent shriek. Mark Anderson. He lives right there. She pointed to the Andersons' house. The rest of the scene was a blur of police procedure and medical urgency. Paramedics arrived and took Liam. He was sobbing, holding a gauze pad over his eye, but they assured David that the cut wasn't deep, just a minor laceration to the eyelid. The more serious concern was any debris that might still be in the eye. They needed to get him to the hospital for a proper checkup. David, looking back at Karen with a look of pure, cutting betrayal, promised he would call her with an update. He didn't wait for her to come with them. He didn't even say goodbye. Karen stood alone, the perfect party in ruins around her, watching her husband and son disappear in the back of an ambulance. Officer Ramirez was now questioning Mark and the Andersons. The tension in the air was palpable, a mix of simmering anger and accusation. Karen felt a raw, blinding need for retribution. This wasn't just an accident. Mark had to have known. He had to be part of it. But part of what? The question gnawed at her, a burning ember in the pit of her stomach. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Karen's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She hadn't even thought to change out of her swimsuit. The perfect, elegant one-piece felt ridiculous now, a costume for a life that didn't exist. She replayed the scene over and over, the memory of that box, that Comet logo, a relentless torment. 10 years ago, she had been a bright-eyed young engineer at Starfire Pyrotechnics, a company on the cutting edge of consumer fireworks. Her job was to test new chemical compounds, to ensure the products were not just dazzling but safe. One of her last projects was the Solstice line, the exact model number on the charred box. It was a revolutionary design, a new type of compound that created more vibrant colors with less smoke. It was also, as she had discovered, dangerously unstable. A slight variation in humidity or temperature during storage could turn it into a tiny incendiary bomb. She had written the report, she had flagged the issue, and she had overseen the recall and destruction of the entire prototype batch. Or so she thought. The company had buried her report, denied her findings, and eventually fired her for being overly cautious. She had moved on, built a new life, and buried the memory of that toxic job. And now, 10 years later, a remnant of that past had just taken a piece of her son. The irony was a bitter poison. She found David and Liam in the emergency waiting room. Liam was quiet now, his face pale, a small bandage over his eye. David sat beside him, his arm around his son, a fortress of cold, silent anger. He didn't look up when she approached. "Is he okay?" she asked, her voice cracking. David's response was a sharp, humorless laugh. "He's going to be fine, Karen. He just needs a few stitches. They're getting the debris out. No permanent damage." "Thank God," she whispered, sinking into the plastic chair beside him. "You know, I told you this wasn't a good idea," David said, his voice low and dangerous. "The party, the showing off, the whole thing." "I don't think you can pin this on me, David," she snapped, her own rage flaring. "This was a criminal act. That man set off illegal fireworks." "Oh, so it's Mark's fault?" David finally turned, his eyes boring into hers. "Maybe, but if you hadn't been so obsessed with your perfect little kingdom, if you hadn't invited our neighbors over to judge them, if you hadn't thrown this ridiculous party in the first place, maybe Liam would have been safe in the house playing a video game. The words were a direct hit. She flinched, but she didn't back down. I was trying to build a nice life for us. This is what we worked for! A nice life? Or a nice picture of a life? David's voice was a whisper now, but it was more devastating than a shout. He looked down at Liam, then back at her. You built a moat around us, Karen. You thought you could keep everything out. The mess, the people, the past. But you can't. It finds you. The doctor called their name then. They went inside and the conversation died, replaced by the sterile hum of the hospital room and the crisp, professional tone of the nurse who was cleaning Liam's wound. Later, as they were leaving, David holding a drowsy Liam in his arms, Karen saw them. The Andersons, Mark included, were sitting in a different waiting area. They looked defeated, tired, their earlier easygoing demeanor replaced by a heavy dread. Mr. Anderson was on his phone, and Maya was whispering to Mark, who was nervously picking at his fingernails. Karen felt an overwhelming need for answers. She broke away from David and strode toward them. The raw, unfiltered anger she had suppressed for hours surged to the surface. I hope you're happy, she said, her voice shaking with controlled fury. My son is getting stitches because of you. Mr. Anderson looked up, his face a mask of exhaustion. Karen, we are so sorry. We had no idea he was doing that. I swear to God. Oh, you had no idea? Karen scoffed. Did you also have no idea that your brother was setting off illegal, discontinued fireworks that are banned for being dangerously unstable? Fireworks that killed people 10 years ago? Her words hit them like a physical blow. Mark's head snapped up. Mr. Anderson's phone fell from his hand, clattering to the linoleum floor. Maya's eyes, wide with a new kind of horror, moved from Karen to her husband to Mark. What? What are you talking about? Mr. Anderson whispered, his voice hoarse. Discontinued? What are you talking about, Karen? I'm talking about the truth, she hissed, leaning in. The truth that you're all hiding. The truth about why he had that specific box. I know what that brand is. I know what that model number is. And you know what else I know? She paused, letting the silence build. She had their undivided, terrified attention. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, a cruel smile touching her lips. I know that my husband David just got a phone call. Not from a doctor, not from the police. From someone else. A private investigator. The lie rolled off her tongue effortlessly, fueled by a decade of repressed rage and a desire to see them squirm. She had no idea who had called David, but it didn't matter. The raw animal fear in Mark Anderson's eyes was the only confirmation she needed. He knew something. He had to. He had just been told his entire life was about to be turned inside out. He had just been told his perfect life was about to be destroyed. And for a moment, in the sterile, fluorescent glow of the hospital waiting room, a cold, dark satisfaction, a taste of a revenge that felt 10 years in the making, settled in her heart. Mark's face went white. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, he just stared at her, his eyes full of a new, chilling, and undeniable realization. He knew exactly who had really called David, and it wasn't a private investigator. It was the one person in the world who could confirm Karen's dark, buried past. Mark's face, a second ago a canvas of panic, contorted into a new kind of horror. It was a silent, gut-wrenching realization that bypassed words. His eyes, fixed on Karen's face, weren't seeing a distraught mother anymore. They were seeing a ghost, a piece of a past he had only heard whispers of, a history that David had tried to keep buried. Karen's lie about the private investigator was a fishing line. But Mark's reaction was the terrified thrashing of a man who had just been snagged by a much larger, more dangerous hook. David's voice from a few feet away was a low rumble. Karen, what are you doing? Let's go, but Karen ignored him. Her victory felt too sweet to abandon. She was in a zone, fueled by a decade of suppressed bitterness and the adrenaline of her son's injury. The hospital waiting room, with its sickly fluorescent lights and hushed tones of misery, was her stage. The truth is, Karen continued, her voice a low purr of triumph, David didn't get a call from a private investigator. He got a call from someone who was supposed to be dead. The air in the hospital waiting room seemed to thicken. Mr. Anderson's wife, Maya, gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Mr. Anderson? His face ashen, stumbled back, his eyes darting between Karen and Mark. David, sensing the dangerous turn of the conversation, started walking towards Karen, his face a storm of fury. "Karen, that's enough," he said, his voice laced with a cold warning. "Let's get out of here." Karen didn't back down. She met his gaze, her eyes defiant. "No, David, it's not enough." "Not until he tells me." She pointed at Mark. "Who called you, David? Was it him? Is he the one you've been protecting all this time?" Mark shook his head, a single violent motion. "I swear I don't know who you are. I just bought the box, and you expect me to believe that?" Karen's voice rose, a sharp, accusing wail. The few other people in the waiting room looked up, their conversations dying. This was no longer a personal feud. It was a spectacle. "That box was supposed to be destroyed 10 years ago. No one should have it." The weight of her past was suddenly tangible, a heavy cloak she couldn't shed. It was in the silence that followed, in the way David's face went even paler, in the absolute terror etched on Mark Anderson's face. He knew something. He had to. "You don't understand," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. "He told me to just get the fireworks out of the garage. He said they were for a show, a joke, that they were just duds." "Who told you?" Karen demanded, her voice a whip crack. Mark looked past her, his eyes fixed on a point behind her. His face was a mask of fear and genuine disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, a new voice cut through the air. "That would be me, Mark. I told you to get them." The voice was low, resonant, and familiar. Karen froze. The sound of it sent a jolt of ice down her spine, a tremor she had felt only once before. She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Standing in the doorway of the waiting room was a man she hadn't seen in a decade. He was older, his hair a little grayer at the temples, but the piercing, intelligent eyes and the sardonic smile were unmistakable. It was Michael Thorne, her former boss from Starfire Pyrotechnics, the man who had buried her report. The man she had believed was responsible for the accidents. The man who was supposed to be in jail or worse. He walked into the waiting room, his steps deliberate and confident. He wasn't dressed like a hospital visitor. He wore a tailored suit, a silk tie, and a sneer that hadn't faded with time. He looked directly at Karen, his smile widening. "Hello, Karen," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "It's been a while. You look exactly the same. Obsessed with appearances. Obsessed with perfection." David, who had reached Karen's side, put his arm around her protectively. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. "David Thorne," Michael corrected, looking at him with a casual cruelty that made Karen's blood run cold. "And you must be David, Karen's new husband. The man she's been hiding from me." Karen's mind reeled. Michael was David's last name. The puzzle pieces, scattered and forgotten, clicked into a horrifying picture. David's evasiveness, his sudden call, the reason he hadn't wanted to talk about his family. It was a secret kept for 10 years. "David and Michael were brothers. My name isn't Thorne," David said, his jaw clenched. "It's Miller. David Miller." Michael chuckled, a hollow sound that echoed in the quiet waiting room. "Ah, the old name change trick?" "Very dramatic. Very—" "Karen. No, David, you're a Thorne. Just like me. Just like our father. The one who owned Starfire Pyrotechnics." Karen felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at David, her husband of 8 years, the man she had built a life with, the father of her son. The man who, she now realized, had been living a lie that had just come crashing down on her perfect pool party. The truth of the phone call from earlier was a bitter, stinging revelation. It wasn't a private investigator. It was Michael. He had called David. He had known about the fireworks. He had known exactly what was going to happen. "You knew," Karen whispered, her voice barely audible. "You knew they were dangerous. You knew what they would do to Liam?" Michael shrugged, a casual gesture that was so utterly horrifying in its nonchalance. "I knew they were the Solstice line, yes. But I assumed you would know what to do. You always were so good at R&D, Karen. You always knew how to clean up a mess." His words, loaded with a decade of resentment and dark history, were an open wound. They were a cruel reminder of the past she had tried to erase. "Wait a minute," Mr. Anderson said, his voice trembling. "Michael Thorne, You're the one who gave my brother those fireworks? Michael finally turned his attention to Mark and Mr. Anderson, his smile gone. You know, Mark, I did tell you they were just duds. I figured you'd be a bit more careful, a bit more discreet. But then again, you never were the sharpest tool in the shed, were you? I just needed them out of my garage. A little problem to get rid of. A problem? Karen spat. They nearly blinded my son. They're illegal! They were supposed to be destroyed! We were told they were duds, Thorne, Mr. Anderson said, his voice gaining an edge of steel. You told my brother they were harmless. You said they were just for a laugh. And who's laughing now? Michael's smile returned, cruel and cutting. I got rid of a liability, and in doing so, I exposed a secret that's been bothering me for 10 years. You see, I was getting married, and David here, my little brother, refused to come, refused to even speak to me, all because of a little incident from his past. He looked at David, a cold fire in his eyes. You've been hiding from me for years, David, hiding from all of us. And you thought a new name, a new life, and a perfect wife would be enough to escape? You thought you could just disappear? You owe me, David. You owe me for what you did. What you did to our family. Karen's head was spinning. What had David done? The man she knew. The quiet, kind man who built their perfect house and loved their son couldn't have a past this dark. This wasn't her David. This was a stranger. I didn't do anything, David said, his voice a low growl. I just wanted to get away from you. From all of you. And you thought you could, Michael said, shaking his head with mock sadness. But you can't, little brother. You can't escape family, and you certainly can't escape your own mistakes. He looked at Karen, his expression turning cold. You see, Karen, you're not the only one with secrets. You're not the only one who buried a past and hoped it wouldn't come back to haunt them. You thought you were so clever. You thought you could save face by testifying against us, by burying the evidence, by walking away with your hands clean. But you didn't. Because you're not a victim, Karen. You're a co-conspirator. The words hit her like a physical blow. A cold dread seeped into her veins. It was the one accusation that was true. She had known the fireworks were dangerous. She had written the report. But she had also seen the writing on the wall. She had been offered a way out. She had been given the chance to walk away, to bury the evidence, to get a clean break from the scandal that had rocked the company. The price of her silence had been a hefty severance package and a letter of recommendation. A letter she had used to get the job where she met David. A letter written by the same man who now stood before her. What are you talking about? David said, his face a mask of disbelief. Karen, is this true? The question hung in the air. The police were coming back into the waiting room, drawn by the commotion. Michael Thorne looked at Karen, a cruel smile on his face, as if daring her to tell the truth. And then the police were there, their presence a cold, unforgiving reality. Officer Ramirez looked from Michael to David to Karen, his expression unreadable. What's going on here? He asked, his voice all business. Michael looked at the officer, then at Karen, and he smiled. It was a dark, malevolent grin, a final twist of the knife. He pointed his finger directly at Karen. Officer, he said, his voice calm and clear, I can tell you exactly where those fireworks came from. They came from a batch that my company, Starfire Pyrotechnics, illegally hid away 10 years ago. A batch that was supposed to be destroyed. A destruction order that was signed off on and then ignored by the head of our R&D department at the time, a woman named Karen. The world spun. It wasn't about the Andersons anymore. It wasn't about David's secret family. It was about her. And as Officer Ramirez's gaze turned from Michael Thorne to her, a single terrifying question written on his face. The silence that followed Michael's accusation was a physical weight, pressing down on Karen. Every eye in the waiting room, Officer Ramirez's, David's, the Andersons, was now a cold, unblinking lens focused on her. The air, once thick with the smell of sulfur and fear, was now crackling with a different kind of static, the electricity of a lie laid bare. What did you say? Officer Ramirez's voice was a flat, low hum, devoid of emotion, which somehow made it more terrifying than a shout. He wasn't looking for a confession. He was gathering facts. Michael's smile was a masterpiece of malevolence. He didn't repeat himself. Instead, he took out his phone. Officer, I'm going to save you some time. A quick search of the public record for Starfire Pyrotechnics corporate scandal will yield a lot of interesting news reports from a decade ago. It's all there. The tragic accidents, the government investigation, and the whistleblower who signed off on the destruction order for the exact batch of fireworks that was just set off in your jurisdiction. He looked directly at Karen. Only she wasn't a whistleblower. She was a key player. The one who had the most to lose and the most to gain by the company's downfall. Karen's mind raced, a frantic search for a plausible lie. "He's making this up," she insisted, her voice shrill and unconvincing. "He's trying to shift the blame." Shift the blame? Michael's laugh was a sharp, bitter sound. "I wasn't the one who bought a house next door to a potential customer and planted a bomb in their garage, Karen. That was you, wasn't it?" The accusation was so wild, so far from the truth, that for a split second, Karen felt a flicker of hope. He was overreaching. This was the opening she needed. "You gave those fireworks to your brother, Michael." "You're trying to ruin my life!" "And you, Karen," David said, his voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice, "are an expert at that." "Ruining lives! Did you ruin my last name too? Was that a part of the deal? Did you ask me to change my name because you were hiding from your own past?" The venom in his voice was a fresh wound. She looked at him, the man she had loved and trusted for 10 years, and saw only a stranger. "David, please. It's not what it looks like." "What does it look like, Karen?" he demanded, his hands clenching into fists. "It looks like you've been living a lie for a decade. It looks like you married me and had a son with me and pretended everything was perfect, all while a ticking time bomb was sitting in our backyard. It looks like you were waiting for something to go wrong so you could finally have a reason to get rid of my family." "No," Karen cried, the single syllable a desperate, painful plea. "I didn't. David, I love you. I love our son. I never wanted this." "You're right," Michael interjected, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "She didn't want this. She just wanted control. Control over her life, control over her money, control over the narrative." He turned to David, a cruel triumph in his eyes. "Tell her, David. Tell her what you really did. Tell her why you changed your name." David's body was a rigid, trembling line. His face was a mask of raw emotional pain. He looked at Karen, and for the first time since the firework exploded, she saw something other than anger. She saw the crushing weight of a secret he had carried alone. A secret so heavy he had been willing to abandon his family to bury it. When Starfire went under, David began, his voice barely a whisper. "My father, he paused, swallowing hard. "He killed himself. He couldn't handle the scandal. The lawsuits. He couldn't handle the guilt." Karen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. This was a piece of the puzzle she had never known. The corporate scandal was more than just a scandal. It was a human tragedy. "And Michael here," David continued, his voice now a low growl of pure hate. "He ran the company into the ground. He knew about the unstable products, but he kept selling them. He kept burying the reports. He didn't care about a little collateral damage as long as the money kept flowing." Michael shrugged, utterly unapologetic. "It's called business, little brother. You wouldn't understand. You were too busy playing white knight." "I was the one who was supposed to go to the police," David said, his eyes filled with the agony of a decade of regret. "I was the one who was supposed to blow the whistle. I had the documents. I had the proof. But then Karen came to me." He looked at Karen, his gaze full of a fresh, biting resentment. "She told me she had a better idea. She told me we could work together. She would sign off on the destruction order, I would get the police to back off, and we would both walk away with our hands clean. She promised me we would get justice, and that we would get rid of all the evidence so no one else could be hurt. I was trying to help." Karen cried out, "Help!" David's laugh was brittle, on the verge of shattering. "You took a deal, Karen. You took money and a letter of recommendation. You sold out all those people who were hurt for a clean slate and a hefty payday. You didn't care about justice, you cared about yourself." This was the truth. The dark, ugly truth that she had buried under a meticulously built life of luxury and perfection. It was a deal with the devil, and Michael Thorne was the grinning, cruel-eyed demon who had just collected his payment. Officer Ramirez, who had been listening intently, finally took a step forward. He looked at the chaos of Karen's ruined life, at the raw, visceral pain on David's face, and at Michael's smug, triumphant expression. He then looked back at Karen. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "There are a lot of details here that don't add up. And I have some questions about that destruction order." The world seemed to spin. Karen felt a wave of dizziness. She was losing control. The perfect image she had so carefully crafted was shattering into a million pieces. She looked at David, her last ally. But David wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his brother, then at his son, then at the ambulance that had just taken their son away. "You knew," David said, his voice a low, chilling whisper as he turned his back on her. "You knew that box was still out there. You knew it was a ticking time bomb. You knew it could happen at any time. And you said nothing." And as Officer Ramirez took her arm, leading her out of the sterile hospital waiting room and into the cold night, Karen's perfect world collapsed around her. She looked back one last time at David, who refused to. The interrogation room was the antithesis of her meticulously designed life. It was a box of cinder blocks painted a grim institutional white. The air was stale, smelling of old coffee and quiet desperation. It was a stark and brutal contrast to the chlorine-scented, sun-drenched sanctuary of her backyard. Officer Ramirez sat across from her, his expression a polite but unyielding wall. He wasn't aggressive. He was worse. He was methodical. "Ma'am," he began, his voice a low monotone, "let's go over this one more time. You signed off on a destruction order for the Starfire Solstice line of fireworks in 2015. Is that correct?" Karen, stripped of her perfect facade, felt a cold dread seep into her bones. Her attorney, a public defender named Mr. Jones, was a nervous man who looked at her with a mix of pity and disbelief. "My client maintains that she signed the order in good faith, believing the products were to be destroyed." Ramirez ignored the attorney, his gaze fixed on Karen. He slid a folder across the table. It was thin, but the weight of it felt like a lead anvil. "And here, ma'am, is a copy of the official shipping manifest. This manifest shows that a substantial portion of that very same product line was not destroyed, but rather transferred to an off-site warehouse. The signature on the transfer form? Yours?" A wave of nausea washed over Karen. This was it. The final brutal reality. The deal she had made wasn't a pact for a clean slate. It was a carefully orchestrated maneuver to make her complicit. They hadn't needed her to be a whistleblower. They had needed her to be an accomplice. Michael had never intended to destroy the fireworks. He had simply wanted to move them off the books, with a legitimate-looking signature to cover his tracks. Her carefully constructed world, built on the foundation of a lie, was crumbling around her. She had been so blinded by her desire for money and a new life that she hadn't seen the trap. She had signed the document, not as a defiant act of justice, but as an act of calculated self-preservation. She had traded her integrity for a severance package and a life of luxury. Now that same document was her undoing. The hours bled into a single terrifying nightmare. The public defender tried to negotiate, but Michael Thorne's testimony and the document trail were undeniable. Michael had given the police everything: the warehouse location, the transfer documents, even emails from a decade ago that proved Karen's complicity. He was saving himself by throwing his little brother and his co-conspirator to the wolves. And then, the final, most brutal truth emerged. David had called her from the hospital, not to console her, but to confront her with the truth he had just discovered. She had, in a moment of vengeful rage, accused him of being a part of his brother's conspiracy. But the truth was, David had been working on something of his own. For years, he had been trying to find a way to expose Michael and clear his family's name. The phone rang in the interrogation room, and Mr. Jones picked it up. He listened, his face going pale. He hung up and looked at Karen, his expression a mixture of awe and pity. "That was your husband, Mrs. Miller," he said. "Or rather, David Thorne. He just gave the police the location of a storage unit in New Jersey. It's filled with his father's personal files. And they corroborate everything Michael just told them. It confirms that you knew exactly what you were signing." "No," Karen whispered, shaking her head. "He wouldn't. He couldn't. He did." Mr. Jones said, his voice flat. "It seems he's been working on this for years. He's been putting the pieces together, waiting for the right time. He said he had to get his son away from all of this. From Michael. And from you." Karen's heart sank to the bottom of her stomach. The full weight of the truth settled over her, cold and unforgiving. David hadn't changed his name to escape his brother. He had done it to escape her. She had been so consumed by her own secrets that she hadn't seen his. She had been so worried about the past coming back to haunt her that she hadn't realized he had been patiently digging it up the entire time. Her perfect life had been an illusion. The immaculate house, the effortless parties, the adoring husband, the beautiful son, it was all a beautifully constructed lie. And the one man she had trusted to protect her from the past had been the one digging her grave. The next few hours were a blur of paperwork, fingerprinting, and a booking photo that captured a woman stripped of every pretense. Karen, once a queen in her own kingdom, was now just another perp. The perfect pool day had become a criminal investigation. The sun had set, and the fireworks had left nothing but ash and the ruins of her life. Months passed. The scandal was a media firestorm, a decade-old story reignited with a shocking new twist. Michael Thorne was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud and endangerment. The public record, once a distant, abstract thing, was now the front page of every tabloid, filled with the story of Karen's complicity. Karen was released on bail, a pariah in her community. Her neighbors avoided her. Her friends didn't return her calls. The perfect life she had spent a decade building was gone. The house, the car, the credit cards, they were all tied to David, who had taken Liam and moved to a different city. He had filed for divorce and for full custody, a process made easier by Karen's legal troubles. The final, ironic blow came from the Andersons. A small article tucked away on the back page of the local newspaper reported that Liam had made a full recovery. He had a small, barely noticeable scar above his eye, a permanent reminder of the pool party that had changed everything. The Andersons, feeling a profound sense of guilt, had started a foundation in his name, a fund to provide free eye care and safety education to children in their community. Mark, a changed man, was the foundation's new spokesperson. They had found purpose in the chaos that Karen had caused. The final scene took place on a cold autumn evening. Karen stood alone in her backyard, the leaves a burnt orange carpet on the ground. The pool, once a sparkling blue invitation, was now covered with a dark, wrinkled tarp. The pool toys were gone. The tiki torches were gone. The grill was gone. It was just her, the empty house behind her, and the silent, unblinking eyes of the world outside her fence. Her phone vibrated in her hand. It was an email from her lawyer. A settlement offer had been made by David's legal team. A generous one, considering her situation. All she had to do was sign the papers, forfeit any claim to the house and their shared assets, and she would walk away with a small but substantial amount of money. The final line of the email was a cruel, poetic echo of her past. "This will be your final destruction order." Karen looked at her reflection in the dark, still water of the pool's tarp cover. The woman staring back at her was not the glamorous, confident queen from the title. She was a woman alone, a prisoner of her own choices, forever haunted by the chaos that had been unleashed on the one day she had dared to be perfect. The karma of the fireworks had found its final, devastating target. It had found her.